join us,
Then
or
the
you would
other
rather
side.
see it? All right. I'd like to welcome everybody to this SDN Democracy Futures seminar. We are almost at the end of the year. I am John Keane. I helped to found SDN. I want to acknowledge that we meet on the lands of the Gadigal people, whose lands they shall remain. There, as you know, there is a history of some 40,000 years of the Gadigal people on these lands, and there is still a large indigenous community that lives in this part of the city that is now called Sydney, and I want to acknowledge their elders past and present and the community who live in our area. This series has been a whole year-long series on revolution. Some of you are probably tired of the topic, but it seemed to us that given that it's the centenary of the Bolshevik revolutions in 1917, a couple of revolutions in that year, and the French events of May 68 are just around the corner, and it's half a century in remembrance of those events, that we would put on a series on the topic of revolutions, a topic that has been full of surprises, in part because the topic itself is about surprise. One of the remarkable things, as you know, about revolutions is that they are not planned. They operate according to the principle of contingency and surprise. They're dramatic upheavals. Peoples are typically never different after those revolutions. Those revolutions don't happen in hours or days or weeks. They often take a very long time to work themselves through, so to say. They are often peppered with violence. They are dramatic power grabs, and they have transformative effects on institutions. And probably, as we see from the case of the Ukraine, they are by no means over. The presumption that the age of revolutions has come to an end seems most improbable. Dr. Olga Oleinikova is a distinguished young scholar who has a degree from, a doctorate is from the University of Sydney, who has worked with SDN for the last several years, has built single-handedly, but then with colleagues, a world's first Ukraine democracy initiative. It's a network of scholars and organizations. It's a platform. I urge you to visit the platform, UDI platform, to see the kinds of things that Olga and her colleagues are doing. Olga is currently a scholarly teaching fellow at UTS. She's also an honorary associate of SDN here at the University of Sydney, and is going to speak today to us about the Maidan revolution. The fourth anniversary, as you may know, is coming up in November of this year. And it is a revolution that caused a lot of media coverage at the time. It seems since then to have disappeared in the age of breaking news. But it is a revolution that was dramatic. Its consequences, as I think Olga will explain, are by no means yet clear. But it is a revolution that took place in and against the backdrop of war. To add some sense of what is at stake in this seminar and the topics that Olga will raise, remember that the war in Ukraine has now entered its fourth year. At least 1.5 million people displaced as refugees. 10,000 civilians have so far died. There are something like 60,000 Ukraine soldiers on the eastern front. What was thought to be some kind of peace agreement, the so-called second version of the Minsk Accords, haven't been implemented and seem not to command much popularity among the Ukraine population. 7% of the territory of Ukraine is under occupation. 400 kilometers of the border are uncontrolled, and you may know that in addition to the serious fighting that is going on in this low-level, slow burn, slow motion form of war that Putin is good at, there's also a media war that is going on, and the taking down of web platforms in parts of Ukraine is part of this. There is a constant, on the ground, a constant media war going on. So this is the context in which Maidan should be discussed, I think. And Olga, welcome back to the university, and we look forward very much to hearing what you have to say.
Yes, thank you, John, so much for this invitation. Thank you, Janice, Rachel, Lindy. Lindy's not here. Yeah, I'm happy to be back, as you mentioned. So I still hold the position of honorary postdoctoral fellow with Sydney Democracy Network, so still work on projects which are happening around Ukraine. I'll tell you a little bit more about that. I was very thrilled when John invited me to talk about Ukraine. It's my homeland, right? I lived there for 24 years before coming to Australia, and just 2 weeks ago I returned from Ukraine, so my impression of what Ukraine is like after 4 years of the Euromaidan is quite fresh. Emotionally and economically, I saw just the other months what's happening there in Kiev and the other cities. So I'm very happy that we have this discussion and we can analyze and what happened in these 4 years. Yeah, what this Maidan was for and how people feel today about it. Before talking about the Euromaidan, I want to quickly tell you about the Ukraine Democracy Initiative, which was mentioned by John. And it's the first Australian research platform on democratic transition in Ukraine. Right? So we started it a year ago in 2016 with the help of John, with the help of 2 donors. So we have external funders who support our research on Ukraine. And it has been a great success now. So we're expanding that, and we are now, so basically UTS, where I'm teaching now, is co-hosting Ukraine Democracy Initiative 2 along with Sydney Democracy Network. So that has been proved to be a very amazing relationship and productive one. So as was mentioned, we have a website, right, where you can go and you can see our research insights. You can see all our associates as well. So we have the Ukraine Democracy Initiative has more than 200 associates in 16 different countries. So it's all people who research Ukraine, you know, who are civic activists in Ukrainian field of democracy, who are writers, who are artists, right? So we try to unite everyone who cares about democracy in Ukraine. We have 2 research projects going on. One is on the role of diaspora in democratization in Ukraine. So it's a big project where we're writing a book together now with John, with Jumana actually about that. And Ukraine is a central case study of showing how diaspora has an impact on, you know, diaspora here or in US. Ukrainians have impact on what's happening in Ukraine on the land, right? And the second project is about the state of democracy as well in Ukraine, and I can tell about that a bit later on. And we have 8 UDI team members who are working on this initiative together, so it's as well scholars plus just associates who support us. So whenever you have a chance, you can go and join us as well. More information will be on this website. So as I mentioned, my passion is Ukraine. It's all around Ukraine, all around what is happening in Ukraine, and now it's amazing that we're having this talk because, as John mentioned, on 21st of November, or on 27th actually, I should correct that, this year we'll celebrate 4 years after Euromaidan, right? It has been a revolution which is still ongoing, right? As many activists and many soldiers would tell you that revolution hasn't finished, right? So it's still, the fight still continues. First, before jumping into losses and gains of the Euromaidan, right? We can analyze it today. I want to quickly look back and into what has happened there, right? Because I know that many of you are not familiar maybe with Ukrainian case. And I think Australia lacks this expertise on Ukraine, and we really, I think I felt it specifically in 2013 when all the events started, Australian media outlets and media corporations, they were approaching basically University of Sydney asking for some scholars who are doing something on Ukraine in Australia. So there is no expertise in Australia on that region and specifically on Ukraine, right? So that's definitely a need for that. So I feel I'll start with a kind of looking back and analyzing what happened. So everything started in November, as I mentioned, 2013. It started from the pro-European Union demonstration, we would call it, and it was caused initially by the failure of the Yanukovych government to sign the deal with EU, right, the association agreement with EU. And it was assigned to all the population and to younger people that, you know, we stick with Russian vector of development, we continue cooperation in that region, and EU remains a kind of long-term perspective, but not today, right? And there was this clash between what people and younger people felt about it, and it started with a demonstration of students who just went out on Maidan and they just declared the European choice, the European values, and the desire basically to have a kind of different vector of development, right? So the protest started with the students, it continued, there was a violent oppression from the police side of this protest. It was freezing temperature, it was snowing, right? So the whole condition for, cold condition for hot revolution, let's put it this way. So the violence was escalating in response to the, and with the government forces, and as Boris Nemtsov, we'll just mention him because he was the one who suggested first numbers publicly of the protesters who were there in November. So he mentioned that there were 400,000 to 800,000 of protesters, right, who started in November. And you know, Boris Nemtsov has died, right, in 2015. Actually, he was killed, right, but that's another topic. So basically, this violent protest, it has got through a different turn in January, but we'll talk about that later, right? So that's just a setup to look back on how it all started. Okay, so and definitely we can say that social media was the one who were bringing the news about Euromaidan. So hashtag Euromaidan was created on Twitter in the beginning of November, right, with all the protests, and it actually was evident from the beginning that it's more than just angry response to the failure of the EU vector development, right? It was more than that. So I have some interesting insights which I want to suggest, some quotes, right, which came from my friends. So I asked my journalist friends in Ukraine to give me some quotes. You know, they interviewed some NGO activists and journalists, so they can give. You can hear the stories, right? Which is always more powerful than tell you just the stats and figures. So one of the journalists, what she was saying is that Euromaidan has grown into something far bigger than just an angry protest, right? An angry response, right, to the fallen through EU deal. It's now about ousting Yanukovych and his corrupt government, guiding Ukraine away from its 200-year-long, deeply intertwined and painful relationship with Russia, and standing up for basic human rights to protest, speak, think freely, to act peacefully without the threat of punishment, right? So as we can see, it grew bigger, right? So there was other problems in the society that were just fueled by this failure of the EU signing of the deal. Also, I just found interesting very quote that, you know, Moscow Times, and that I think it's clearly as well explains the political importance of Ukraine, is that Ukraine remain a key geopolitical prize in Eastern Europe for Russia and the EU, right? So it's still, this debate is still ongoing, and still, geopolitical division in the region still haven't stabilized in a way. When we talk about the attitudes, right, of people in the beginning of Euromaidan, and I'm sociologist by training, so I like to speak, opinion polls, numbers, right, in combination with the kind of quotes and insights. Just as a quick. Oh no. Yeah. Euromaidan. So we can't say that, people were 100% united on support of Euromaidan in the beginning, and we shouldn't deny that was, it was not one line, and this protest was not coming out anonymously, basically, from the population, right? So the opinion polls show that there was a division, so more than, thank you so much. So I just found a couple of interesting opinion polls, which are a bit controversial, but they give you the sense of that. So according to the December study by Research and Branding Group, 49% of all Ukrainians supported Euromaidan when it started, 45 had the opposite opinions, right? So it was quite half-half. Other polls conducted by Razumkov Center, it's quite a big center in Ukraine, and you can trust it. So they showed that over 50% of Ukrainians supported Euromaidan, while 42 opposed it. Right? So let's imagine it's the beginning, right? Let's just refresh that it's the beginning of the Euromaidan, right? So people were not 100% united on it. Another research poll showed that 45% of Ukrainians supported Euromaidan, while 50 didn't, right? So you can see the spectrum. There was no disunity straight away. As I mentioned, Euromaidan was a lot about joining European Union and about this further and different pathway of development into the future. And it shows completely different insights. So most of Ukrainians, when they were asked, do you see the prospects of joining EU, do you want to join? So 45 respondents would say that they believe that Ukraine should sign association agreement with EU, right? So in that sense, we could see that people were more on the same page in terms of European vector of development. Yeah, they may not support the protest itself, they may not support the protest movement in the beginning, but they were more likely to support pro-European, attitudes in the society, and that's quite important to understand. Interestingly mentioned, I think that's important as well, that Prime Minister at that time, Mykola Azarov, he said that no one invited actually Ukraine to join EU. So the protest is great, but there were no official invitation to join EU, and we don't really know if association agreement doesn't mean much, right? So it's a first step into the EU integration, but no one invited Ukraine at that time, right? So it was more coming of the desires and aspirations of population. So coming to the analysis, which was promised in the synopsis, right, of the talk, is that what are these wins, right? What are the victories of Euromaidan, which we can attribute as victories, and what are the losses, right, which we can see in Ukrainian society? And that was a kind of problematic thing for me to really bring up the wins and losses. So you'll see a bit of not the balanced side of wins and losses, but we can discuss it. I would be interested to hear what you think, as well those who are from Ukraine, right, and you have those who have connection to Ukraine. It would be interesting to hear what your opinions on that are. But I'll start with the wins, right? So what I have identified as 3 wins. So the first one, it's definitely, and it's recognized by all the experts, it's burst of civil society, active people, right? So basically, what happened is that, so Maidan have catalyzed it, right? So Maidan has catalyzed the burst of civil society in Ukraine, which is crucial for everything that goes inside. So I have found, and my friend actually gave me this quote from 2 very big and new NGOs that emerged after Euromaidan. They're very powerful ones, I would say. It's the Euromaidan sauce and their reanimation package of reforms. So this I would say, there are many different NGOs and civic, initiatives that emerged during Maidan, but that too would be the best well-funded, the best, the more structured, the sharpest one, right? So Euromaidan sauce is more into human rights activism and coordinating some Euromaidan sauce organization, which were more of an aid support. At the same time, the reanimation package of reforms is actually an umbrella organization of 80 NGOs who are monitoring the reform process in Ukraine. And they as well are offering expertise on reforms. So if you go, they have a very great website. So if you go, you can see all the analysis each month of what is happening with reforms in Ukraine. So you can track the success of that or failure, and they're quite objective, I would say. So they try to present an objective picture of it. If it's failing, then they're putting it up, and they're trying to come up with a recommendation. If it's not, then no. And they work very closely with the government, especially with the new fresh blood in Ukrainian parliament, right? And we know there are many activists who became MPs, right, after Euromaidan. A lot of activists. So there are the quotes, right, from the people who are driving this NGO sector. What they're saying is that we have seen the start of a new era of NGOs, and some of them are funded by local businesses. And that's an important thing, which signifies is that there is support from inside, financial support. And that's a big difference from what was happening for a long time in Ukraine. So as you know, when Soviet Union collapsed, there were a lot of Western donors who were supporting the civic initiatives in Ukraine, like the National Endowment Fund for Democracy, for example. They invested heaps of money, millions, in developing NGOs and sponsoring democratic initiatives and media projects in Ukraine. So the model of foreign-funded NGOs was a kind of the dominant one for a very long time. And only since Euromaidan, what happened is that people started to basically financially even support the initiatives that are coming from inside. And that's a good symbol of, of this unity and of this civic awakening. We can talk about civic awakening and awareness and self-awareness of what has to be done and how they can contribute themselves, right? And all the activists, basically, in the interviews, when I talk to them, they mention it very proudly that, they're sponsored not by Western donors, but there are some businesses who sponsor them, and they see the difference. Alexandra, so she basically was saying that this is why Ukraine is a single exception of the post-Soviet area, which, despite an ongoing war, demonstrates that it wants to build democratic institutions, while the rest of the country slide away from democratic values. I think she's talking here more in a comparison with Belarus and Russia, because there is a lot of banning on foreign-funded NGOs happening in these countries, right? So Ukraine I just wrote actually a piece about that, about foreign-funded NGOs in Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. I'm comparing, how easy it is to fund even NGOs and civic initiatives in post-Soviet space. And Ukraine proves to be one of the most democratic, and the legislation around that is more open. So if you want to support Ukraine, it's like you can easily do that, right? Comparing to Russia, you can't do it in Russia, and Belarus has a lot of control around foreign funds and investments into that. So that's one of the big and well-recognized wins. So the second wins is that reforms were launched. So we can't deny that, yes, reform process has started. Of course, it's far from bearing some, good productive fruits, but it's happening, right? It's slow. Activists, reformers, they face the highest resistance when they cross the area of interest of those who are in power, right? So we'll talk about the oligarchical structure later on. So there's a lot of resistance as well to reform inside Ukraine. So if we talk about what are the reforms and what has changed, is that, again, the expert from the reanimation package of reform, what he's saying is that the government became much more open. However, the cooperation is not systemic. It depends on the personal factor. There is no collaboration with many ministers, but we can influence processes through media and criticism. Right? So there is more transparency, and there is at least more openness to reforms at this stage, as well from MPs and from ministries, which support you need, right, to do anything, and who would listen to activists. So basically, just a quick summary, like what has happened is judicial reform was launched. Again, like it didn't really, we can see attempts to really reform the system, but it hasn't bear any fruits. Particularly, yes, there were amendments to the constitutional judiciary side. Yes, they approved a package of constitutional amendments reforming the justice system and law and status of judges, but the problem is now the honesty of the judges themselves, right? So that's another big thing, how they can be motivated not to steal, how to be motivated to respond to the, not to misusing their position, right? So there is this human factor which kind of is a stumbling block as well in Ukraine, even in this reform. So a lot of judges, and I think if you follow the news, they were fired officially, right? So members of parliament, they were voting whom to fire, and it was massive. It was all over the news. Like some people, yeah, I think 2 judges couldn't get the right amount of votes to be fired, so they had to vote like 5 times or 3 times to fire them. So that was a kind of very, yeah, we can discuss that process, separately. What has happened is that, yes, there was some transparency in anti-corruption reforming started in a way. What they've done, they've introduced this e-declaration for all, civil servants and member of parliament, and we saw this huge wealth which all they have. So that was good, it was a gesture of transparency, but all the population was shocked that all these people have these huge assets, and most of them are not holding their funds in the banks, in Ukrainian banks, which shows huge distrust to bank system by the governors and the MPs, which was huge debate in the media, like how come, if you're not investing in the banks, you're not holding money in Ukrainian banks, like why ordinary people should basically do that, right? So there was a huge debate around that, so it caused even more distrust, I would say, to politicians, despite the fact of this, good gesture. Decentralization reform, right? So what is happening is that basically for a long time, and it's one of the Soviet legacies, is that Ukraine still experienced this bloated and efficient system of governance that gives little power to local communities. So as the expert, again, I gave a quote, so you can hear what people say, is that among all European countries which started voluntarily merging municipalities, Ukraine had the fastest pace. Unfortunately, the position of the Verkhovna Rada, the parliament, and the Central Election Committee have not allowed to speed up even more, but the system can't keep up with the changes in legislation and can't yet use the rules to achieve success. So again, there's some legislation in place, but in terms of enacting the change, there's a lot of problems happening in Ukraine on that. So we can say that experts say that there is a positive change, but again, there's a lot of pessimism and a lack of implementation on many of the reforms, right? And it's different, but we can call it as a win because reforms have started, right? Another win, which were highly over the news, and Poroshenko, I think, was proud of it so much because he can show at least some kind of cooperation with the EU and some kind of, step towards Ukraine one day potential integration into EU as a member. So they've signed Ukraine-European Union Association Agreement, right? And so it had some positive effect in the beginning because the exports from Ukraine basically to EU has increased, but they decreased significantly by 22%. So they increased by 2% and decreased in the next quarter by 22% because Ukraine just couldn't, get out of it the most, out of this trade agreements. Plus, so that's a controversial thing, but people are very happy about this association because it's a sign, they were standing for European Union in the Maidan. At least, we're not a member, but at least we have, some moves towards that, and here it is. Also, another big win, which was as well very everywhere in the news, is that finally Ukraine received visa-free travel in EU, right? Again, but you can't work there, you can't do many, just a visa-free travel, and again, we can argue to which extent, how many liberties and how much things, Ukraine got out of it. No, but yes, we can travel today. Ukrainians can travel today in EU without visas for 3 months. Yeah, but you have to have bookings of the hotels. You have to show money in the bank account. So there is still, it saved the nation 35 euros on a visa. I would say that would be, because the visa costs 35 euros. That's the only, basically thing which saved some money for the nation. So that would be the win, right? Coming to the losses. Yeah, and I maybe sound kind of pessimistic around that, but we can discuss it after that. So one of the biggest loss, and that's unarguably, it's a war, right? And war is a huge, it's a huge thing, right? And it has effect on all the areas of life in Ukraine. And I maybe will tell you just a kind of quick story of this guy, and you'll get a sense of what it is. So basically this guy, his name is Metro, and he was Euromaidan activist. Yeah, he was, and he still is the press officer of the Donbass Battalion, and he's founder of a movement called New Fire. And he agrees with the statement that if there were no Euromaidan, there will be no war, right? So what he's saying is that, Putin could not have found a better moment for the military intervention, right? He would try to conquer Ukraine politically as he had done for many years before, right? So that was a kind of sign of. So Euromaidan created this atmosphere for Russia to step in basically and try to return Ukraine. So so we can say that war. I'll finish with his case and then I expand a little bit on that. So with this guy, his case is very interesting because he was not supportive of Euromaidan from the beginning. So he didn't care a lot about European integration, right? And there's many young people who didn't as well as did. And but he said when the students were beaten, so the first demonstration, the students were beaten. Of course, I came to the square because the question of social justice is higher than any Euro integration, right? So we can see that his position, has changed when it comes to social justice and to response to violence and to injustice. So he basically joined. So he saw the protest. He saw that in February it's getting violent, and he understood that, basically it wouldn't finish without any violence further. And what he's done after the Euromaidan, he went to Crimea, and then he joined basically the Battalion Donbass to fight to join the war, right? And he said in the interviews, which was conducted by my friend, he was saying that after 3 years of war, soldiers experience a lot of betrayal, losses, disappointments, right? And there's a lot of this in Ukraine right now. And he says that nobody among my comrades is disappointed in the fight, but they're disappointed that the current power does not belong to Euromaidan. They are the same representatives of the same parties, but painted in another color, right? So basically what he's saying is that they're facing this destruction of the illusions, which is a healthy maybe process, but they understand why they are protecting their motherland and why they are in the front lines. Just to quickly, I think I didn't mention that those who don't know what's going on. So in 2014, right? So as a response to Euromaidan movement, there was anti-Euromaidan movement, right? And eastern regions of Ukraine were not 100% supportive of that. Russia puppet states emerged basically in Ukraine, right? So the Donetsk Oblast and Lugansk Oblast, they turned into Donbass People's Republic and Lugansk People's Republic, right? So they proclaimed themselves as independent. And Ukraine launched anti-terrorist operation, right? So in Ukraine, in the beginning, no one would use the word war towards that, but they would use the word anti-terrorist operation for many various reasons, because if the country is in war, they can't apply for IMF funding and so on. So there was this, foreign conditions we had to borrow money, right, Ukraine, because we were in debt and we had to sacrifice some things. And at that time, there was this huge debate that we can't proclaim the state of war in Ukraine. And they decided to use the anti-terrorist operation as the strategy to return basically some regions, right, to Ukraine. At the same time, what happened, Russia, so there was a referendum in Crimea. It was not a legitimate referendum, but most of the people, they voted to join Russia. And and since then, basically, Ukraine was annexed, Crimea was annexed by Russia and just became the part of Russia, right? But still, Ukraine doesn't recognize it, right? And many European states, they don't recognize it as well. So that's, we can discuss it, what will be the strategy out of the situation. But both in Eastern, both self-proclaimed republics, Russian currency is there, like it's all time is Russian there, people live by Russian laws, they have Russian passports, so it has become basically, eventually maybe it will become part of Russia or so, right? We don't know, we'll see how it will go, right? But that's what's happening. So as a result, if we talk numbers, right, and John mentioned that, so of course it's a huge loss, and there was 10,000 plus people killed as of August 2017, because it's still ongoing conflict, right? You don't see it over the news, but it's still going on. People are dying there. 1.4 million, of internally displaced people in Ukraine, and what is very shocking is that. But that projection existed as well just before the conflict, but I think the projection maybe will go even lower because of this war and so on. So Ukraine's population will shrink, is predicted by UN Population Division to shrink until 36 million by 2050. And we were at 52 million in 2012, right? So it happens for different reasons, right? For first, of course, huge death rates, which are higher than birth rates. Out-migration as well contribute to that. So now we can say that, there's huge migration out of Ukraine. And I was now in Kiev, and the talks of younger people are all about how to get out of Ukraine, how to go for education, how to find a job somewhere else. Yeah, unfortunately, right? So it's still these conversations that are happening in Ukraine. Most of them are talking about Western countries, right? So that's interesting. Because, as well, interesting information is that most of migrations from Ukraine, 48%, were all done to Russia, especially labor migrations, for the whole history since independence, right? So Russia was one of the biggest trade partners for Ukraine economically, right? And in terms of labor migration and financial remittances, Russia was one of the biggest who actually, again, who sponsored the Ukrainians labor migrants, and they would return money back home, right? Because of this conflict, the ties were cut, right? And Ukraine had to face, had to establish, because they broke the relationship with Russia, trading relationship and so on. They had to establish a relationship with the EU, but that was complicated, right? Because it takes time. So, so there's huge economic dissatisfaction now happening in Ukraine because former opportunities were cut and new haven't been created, right? And that's a big problem now, which ordinary Ukrainians are facing now. Okay, another loss would be the economic decline, right? And that's what we will just big stats here, right? So so economy, of course, in 2014, associated with war and with cut-off trade relationship with Russia has declined, right? So it shrank by 6.8%. In 2015, it continued to further decline, and so on. In 2016, but I haven't put this positive note here. There was a kind of positive progression. The growth started, but it was like 0.2%. It's still happening, but decline is still going on. So, decline is over, basically disbalancing it to the negative, unfortunately, proportion, right? So, so it's still happening, right? So to return to the economic development of Ukraine, to have the GDP, the same as we had before the crisis, it has to grow by 17.5% in 2017. And the highest actual achievement of Ukraine, I think, was 13%. You can see in 2011 or so, right? So imagine like we have to recover so much has to be done for Ukraine to economically recover and to get to the same level at least as it was before the crisis. Another loss, right? So corruption is still continuing. So we can't say that there's a lot of scandals going on in Ukraine at the moment. All the system is in place, so it hasn't changed. So that's an interesting sign. It says, those who don't understand Ukrainian, it says we're changing Ukraine. Sorry for inconvenience, right? So that's what countries experiencing. They're changing the country, but there's so many inconveniences which cause some effects. So as a result of that, we can say the growing poverty levels, right? The average monthly salary is over 200, but the minimum I just checked the other day, it's like $119. So it's the minimum wage, US dollars, right? So it's US dollars. like the natural gas increased by 50%, the utilities like they increased by 40%, and the incomes, the currency Ukrainian hryvnia has devaluated so much, right? So it's very hard, even with visa-free regime, for people to afford even to travel, despite having the sufficient amount of food, clothing, and making savings, right? So that's huge poverty there in Ukraine, and you can feel it like when you're there. So it's growing foreign debt, right? So Ukraine still continues borrowing money. It returns as well some money, which is a good sign, but still we're borrowing more and more. And if we just saw the other day the stat that for each Ukrainian resident, the debt is $3,429, yeah, of the debt, right? And it's growing. So yes, we can say that, as I mentioned, as a win, we have this anti-corruption, activities happening, but still, Ukraine managed to move only 1 point up in the results of the World Corruption Perception Index, right? Ranking still not high, right? Oligarchic system is still in place, as I mentioned, old system is in place, and there is growing disappointment, right? As, again, there is a poll of Kantar TNS Group. I actually worked, before coming to Australia, I worked in Kantar TNS, so it's a market research company, and I like to use always the stats, because I know that they use good methodology. And they're saying that, only 9% of Ukrainians are satisfied with the president's action, and 70% are dissatisfied, right? So imagine this growing unhappiness as well inside the country with everything. Fifth loss. That can be argued, right? But as John mentioned, information war is happening, right, between Ukraine and Russia, and you have the effects, right, the side effects of that, right? Because you can slip into radicalism a little bit, right? Sometimes you can be more protective, and you can ban things which, like in democratic open society, shouldn't be banned. So I think that's what Ukraine is experiencing now a little bit, and it's been voiced by many experts in media that Ukraine, yes, the measures are correct, but still there is a kind of a bit slide into lack of freedom and so on. So what is happening is that I'll show you this. So basically, all Ukrainian media basically owned by oligarchs, right? And that's open information, and how what their own agenda is driving the whole media content. Like what freedom of speech and expression you can talk about. And they have huge wars in between each other, So Poroshenko, president, he owns Channel 5, and it was one of the driving channels of revolution, right? So they were producing the content, which was, at that time, it was a great tool. But still he controls opinion of many Ukrainians, and again, like how can president own huge media channel, and that's not how it should be done in the democratic European countries where we are heading. Or maybe John will comment, I don't know. And there is huge fights in between these guys, like the News One channel, for example, Muraev, he is one of the head of the oppositions to Poroshenko, and his channel was he was accused of some kind of, there was a criminal case launched against him, against his journalists, and so on. Again, Inter channel owned by Firtash, actually the channel was burned, so there was activists who claimed that this channel is pro-Russian and so on, and they just basically burned the whole channel, and it was over the. So that's what, there is this violence which is involved in this withstanding of these big powers, and that just doesn't create the good image of Ukraine as well in the West, and it creates more questions to Ukraine on that. Okay, one of the biggest losses, I would say, and maybe it's not a loss yet, hopefully, right? But the trend is not positive. So Euromaidan was all about, Western vector of development, right, and so on. But what we hear in response, and that, in 2016, basically, European Commissioner Juncker, he said during his speech that Ukraine will definitely not be able to become a member of the EU in the next 20-25 years, and not of NATO either, right? And that's what we can feel as well, from the moves of Europe towards Ukraine and for their talks and discourse. Yes, they support Ukraine on the security side of things and on military aspects of that, but that's the prospect, right? So people wanted European Union membership, but that's what they are told, and I would say that that's a kind of big disappointment as well for Ukrainians. Interesting fact is that what Europeans, that's a kind of very recent survey, and what about the views of Europeans, like are we welcome there or not? And hypothesis should be that, Euromaidan has showed that, Ukraine is Europe, people have the choice, and Europe has to see it and has to kind of, at least, see Ukraine now as a European country, right? So that's, there was this Yalta European Strategy Summit, I think in September, in the beginning of September this year, and Kantar Public Group, they basically conducted a survey, just very fresh data. So they asked, basically countries. I can give you more stats on what the countries were, but it shows that majority of the respondents in three most influential EU states, it's Germany, France, and UK, oppose EU membership of Ukraine, even if Ukraine were to fulfill all conditions for the accession. Opposition to the EU membership of Ukraine increased significantly compared to 2007 in France and in the UK, and the weakest support for Ukraine's membership is in Netherlands, while strongest in Lithuania and Poland, right? So it's like our friends basically there on that line. The new survey supports the research findings and just the research discourse concerning opposition to EU membership of Ukraine in the West, and that the Euromaidan did not lead to radical rise of support for such membership, unfortunately. Another question which was asked, and just interesting, is, in your opinion, is Ukraine part of Europe geographically, historically, and culturally? And we can see as well that the polls show that 56% of the Dutch, 52% of French, 48 British, 45 Germans, 38 Italians do not consider Ukraine as a part of Europe geographically, historically, and culturally. There was a significant rise of perception of Ukraine as non-European countries compared to 2005, because they do it longitudinal studies, so they grab the data each year. It is noteworthy that such a rise took place since the Euromaidan and the war in Donbass. So basically, to sum up, there are a lot of positive things out of Euromaidan revolution, right? So there is this spirit of change, and it really comes from the ground. But the governance of that, the administration of this transition and implementation of changes are really not catching up with what civically is happening and how more dynamism is there. So to sum up, active form society, war and unresolved conflict in Eastern Europe, economic decline, social reforms, departure from Russia, move towards EU, association agreement with the EU was very distant and unclear perspective to join the EU and NATO, and some signs of democratic rollback. The other day, have you seen the new law on education, which was signed by Poroshenko? So there was always all over the news. And Hungary, Russia, of course, and Moldova and Romania responded very harshly to this law. Hungarians even said that they will veto, even if Ukraine joins the EU, they will kind of put a ban and veto on all their decisions which they will be suggesting as a response to this new law, which says that all education in Ukrainian schools have to be conducted only in Ukrainian. So it basically suppresses the minority groups. And of course, in Western Ukraine, we have a lot of Hungarians, we have Poles and so on. And that's, of course, Russia. I believe it was anti-Russian measure, but it touched a lot of as well minorities which live in Ukraine, whose language is being spoken, right? And a lot of Ukrainians in the West, they hold Hungarian passports, they speak like Hungarian and so on. For them, it's like a huge would be loss not to do education in at least some classes in the language, because it will be forbidden. And that's it, and that was huge response of many NGOs and democratic institutions in Europe towards this recently signed document with Poroshenko. So the question is, what's the future, right? So many things has to be done. John was there and Jumana was there. We just had months ago, we had a big session on Ukraine at the European Forum Albak, and we were discussing we had even a Ukrainian MP there present. He came to discuss it. We we had journalists there who worked on ground in Donbass, who saw the war there. So we're discussing like what is the future, and it's a big question. What has to be done? So next presidential elections and next parliamentary elections are happening in 2019. So there's a lot of time until a change can happen legitimately and by law. But what is the future? How it should be structured? How reforms can be accelerated? And economically, what Ukraine should do better to provide for the citizens and to prevent them leaving and to create more wealth inside the country. So I would leave this question open, I would say, because it's a big question. And so this is just the links to Ukraine Democracy Initiative. We have Facebook page, we have email. So if you want to join us or if you want to suggest some topics for discussion or research, please reach out, and we're really open to any type of collaborations and discussions on this. Yes, thank you so much. Hopefully it was informative enough.
Well, thank you, Olga. If it was tennis and if it was Ukraine versus democracy, the first set clearly goes to Ukraine against democracy. Questions, comments? Please state your name. No long speeches. Let's dig into this as deeply as we can, beginning here and then second.
My name's Joe Philippa. I hope this is not nitpicking, but I've picked up from one of the slides that merging municipalities is a desirable thing. I thought that in our experience in New South Wales has been very anti-democratic. So, can you comment on that?
To be honest, I can't comment on Australian cases. To be honest, I wouldn't. I don't know. I think maybe someone else can respond to that. But I can't. I think can't give a response
the proposed Ukraine reforms are decentralizing.
Yeah. So it's a bit different.
Thank you. Very interesting. Could you tell me how the UN, NATO, and the European Union document the case for a cost-benefit analysis on the social, economic, and defence considerations for their future and the Ukraine? How clear is the documentation?
You mean like the benefits of having Ukraine as a part of it?
over a long period of time, so that you could put a future value on it.
So I'm not sure about legislation. I'm not a lawyer or an expert in that. But what is happening and what Ukraine is offering and what is discussed is that Ukraine is first. It's the biggest territory in Europe. It's the biggest country in Europe, right? Geographically, and it has the richest soil, and it has agrarian, like we're very good in the agrarian sector. And what they're doing, they're pushing now reform of land. So foreigners, they want to open it to foreigners to buy the land because now it's forbidden. They can only rent the land, and that's a huge debate around that. So we can offer, the huge debate is about this agricultural, benefits of Ukraine to Europe and to West and so on. Of course, geographically, Ukraine is on the merge with Russia, and if we're talking about geopolitical redistribution of power, Ukraine is a kind of spot where it's a sweet spot. Not the sweet spot for us. It's we end up to be battlefield, right, between two big powers, right, Russia and West, basically, right, and Ukraine, independence, we can question that, how independent Ukraine ever was. Whenever we're independent, we're depending on Russia. Now, getting more dependent on, on Western partners, let's call them. So, in terms of geopolitical redistribution, Ukraine is a very good spot for West to get more influence in that region, right? As I mentioned in the beginning, it will be one of the key wins in the eastern region, right? If the West can get it, So, but in terms of legislation, in terms of documents, I can't, evaluate that. I don't think I have enough expertise to do that.
Yeah.
Graham. Please. Yeah.
Graham Gill,
Yeah.
can I ask two questions?
Yes.
One's conceptual, the other one is about something you said regarding one of the wins. The conceptual question is, you referred to the Maidan revolution, but then when you were talking, it didn't look as though much has changed. So if not much has changed, can we really refer to it as a revolution? Because as John said at the outset, a revolution usually means substantial change. Now one answer might be it's only a couple of years after it. But if you look at most revolutions, there's quite significant change soon after the initial violence, if you like, peters out. So is it really a revolution? And the second one is just thinking about the war in East Ukraine and thinking about what you said were wins. And one of the wins was decentralisation. Well, of course, you could argue that if what the Ukrainian government really wanted to do was to resolve the war issue, one way potentially of doing it would be to lead towards a federal system.
Correct. Yeah.
And that would actually be a step potentially in the direction of democracy. And what that would also do would be to realise that the basic problem in eastern Ukraine was not Russian intervention. It was that there was a problem there to begin with, which was then exacerbated by Russian involvement. And therefore, the only way you're going to solve it is to solve the domestic problem. And federalism might be a way of doing that.
Yeah, I agree with you on that, right? So that's a good idea. And in the Minsk agreements, there was the clause that actually, they have to vote and actually give that territory, if they want to give them a status of the kind of whatever they want to have a status inside the federation. But it just doesn't go in line with current government's agenda in a way, right? So I think I would be supportive of that. If people want to kind of, depart, let them depart. Let's focus on, on a kind of different model, right? How we can integrate this part and work together, right, on something in common. But yeah, there's many arguments for that. There is the it's a whole debate about the integrity of the territory, the foreign view of Ukraine losing the territory, having no power over the territory, having no strength in the region, having no to say. So there's a lot of that. I think the rhetorics that Poroshenko is delivering is that it will be a weakness of Ukraine if Ukraine will do that. In terms of so it's hard. I agree with you on that, but it's not going to happen with this people in power. And so what we had a meeting, right, in Albak, and there was the member of Poroshenko bloc, the member of parliament, and what we were talking a lot about, that what the strategy is now is that yes, they see a lot of civic revival in regions, right, and what they want to do, they want to build the communities around that. They're working now on setting up the different budgets for these communities and educating them how to manage that themselves, right? So there is this moves. So there are these moves. Eventually we will, I think, end up in a kind of decentralized mode and maybe more federation. But yeah, at this stage I don't think it will happen very rapidly, and this government doesn't want to enact that change yet.
Good. I mean, it's worth just pushing you a little bit on this, because one dynamic that historically revolutions gave birth to was the national question, the question of nation building. And you hardly said anything about that. And I think implicit in Graham's question is what kind of nation is being born, who is championing that nation. What I've learned about your case is that there is a tremendous push for decommunization. There is a silence about the multilingual qualities of the nation. I mean, Maidan, as I understand it, the languages that were used in the uprising were Russian, more or less in equal amounts Ukraine and English, and well over 50% of the population speaks, it's not just an Eastern dynamic, speaks Russian. So it is a multilingual entity, a population with very complicated relations with Russia. And it does seem to me that one of the dynamics that you would have to rank as for and against is the birth of a new shared, the championing of a new shared sense of what it is to be Ukraine, and whether and what its relationship is with Russia. That is clearly part of the unresolved business, don't you think?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. Yeah, I didn't mention it actually. Yeah, thanks for bringing it up. Right. So what happened with the Solar Revolution? It was all about like who we are and what Ukraine is about, right? Of course, what we can see that is this wave of Ukrainization, and which has some positive effects and it has some negative effects, right? Which I'm talking about, like with this education, law which Poroshenko signed, right? So more acceptance to minorities, would be a kind of more welcoming approach. But because we have this war and we have this, information war particularly, right? So that's what it can get this into this kind of more radical thing. But I believe that, once, somehow the situation civilizes, maybe then we can get more of an accepting view of Russians as well as a part of Ukraine, because mixed marriages and those who speak Russian doesn't mean that they see themselves as Russians, right? That's the big problem, right? So many people, especially in diaspora, they identify, like if you speak Russian, then you have the kind of Russian choices and so on, but it's not like that completely, right? In Kiev, many people speak Russian just because it happens so, but they're so pro-Ukrainian, they're so patriotic, and they're so anti-Russian in all the senses, right? So it's not linked to this language question, which was pushed very hard in the beginning when Poroshenko came, right? So what they've done, they introduced the law about this second language, right? There will be no chance for Russians to get the kind of say, and that would spark the response of Eastern regions as well to that. So the government, our government, like which came after revolution, right? Poroshenko's part and civic activists, there was this kind of a bit tensions that they could have done milder, and maybe they wouldn't get the response out of it. So I agree that there is problems inside Ukraine, right? They were inside Ukraine, and the way that Crimea, we lost Crimea basically, right? That's a symbol of that as well. That Ukraine didn't work hard enough to integrate Crimea as a part of it, right? Because I have many friends in Crimea. Of course, they now are unhappy with the part of Russia, but at the moment when that was all happening, they were happy to join Russia, right? So that's a kind of very interesting dynamics there. And they always, I'm from Kiev, I always come to see them in Crimea, and they were saying, oh, like you are from Ukraine. I said, no guys, we're like all together, you're Autonomous Republic of Crimea, you're Ukraine, but they always had this mentality that they're not Ukraine completely. So we can't deny that. And I think we can blame the government, Yanukovych government and all the former government, that they didn't work hard enough to integrate, to create this Ukraine nation and the shared values and make them feel that they are, part of Ukraine. It's their fault as well in that population has a kind of turned. Russia stepped in and they at once, went that side. So that's, we had to work as well, I believe. The government had to work more into creating, more unity inside the nation before the whole crisis happened,
And perhaps more cleverly, because one of the things we discussed in our part was the Eurovision Song Contest, which you may or may not know, produced a fiasco. The Russian entrant, disabled Samoylova, I think was her name, was banned from entering the competition. That, of course, led to a whole torrent of abuse from Moscow, saying it just shows that these Ukrainians are fascists and they hate us and so on. The clever response would have been to invite her and to get her to appear on all Ukraine television meeting disabled Ukraine soldiers fresh from the front. This would have been, but it's that kind of dynamic to do with the identity of the nation that is now a constant dynamic in this media war. With, I think, you probably underestimate the really serious forces for a kind of Ukraine nationalism, but this, I think, we need to talk about.
Do you know whether...
Your name, please?
Lesha Holubko. Do you know whether Ukraine continues to supply water and electricity to Crimea
reached some kind of agreement, and Russia is doing it now.
All of it.
Yeah. So basically, Russia took care of all the regions, right? Because there was this tension there, right? Like there was this whole thing, which went a bit wrong, right, from the Ukrainian side as well, right? So Russia basically just took part in that, and the same what happened when eastern Ukrainian regions, basically all the pensioners and elderly people, they couldn't withdraw money from the banks because Ukrainian side cut the bank, money transfer to these regions because they said that they're sponsoring terrorism, right? But there were so many civilians there that just left without saying. And of course, Russia used it as the sense that yes, we were coming, we're giving you
But
this.
don't some of them still go over the other side and collect their pensions?
Yes, some of them still went, right? So some of them basically, a lot of people from Donetsk, like all younger people, I know many people from Donetsk, they're now in Kiev, right? So most young people, they made the choice towards west, right? So basically they went to Kiev and they went somewhere else. But all elderly people, they tend to stay in this region, so they have to cope with that. So there is just a few who went basically, and they took it more as a Ukrainian government just dropped them, So that was the
Some of
response.
them go over to collect their pensions on pension day and then come back.
Yeah, I heard it was practice, but I believe now no longer it is happening because the Russian pension is higher, so why not to move, just let's think, right, economically and practically, why not to kind of take a bigger, and...
But then they would have had to have taken Russian citizenship or something.
Yeah.
Wouldn't they, too?
Yeah, but there is a lot of, in this region, there is a lot of, all those who were pro-Ukrainian, they left basically the region, right? So majority of them are in Kiev and so on. Those who are more, those who would just have no choice or, they're just offended by the whole situation, right? And they feel that something was unfair and so on. So they stayed and they basically just facing the other side, right? So there's a lot of conflict between, these territories. And even if we look into integration of this territory back, I don't know, so much work has to be done to work with these people to make them come back. So that's a huge, big, work that has to be done on that. Yeah.
Rob Donkersley. Maidan is arguably the third or fourth major trigger point for change in Ukraine. There have been changes, Orange Revolution, changes of president, all this stuff.
Yeah.
None of them have been taken. What is it in the Ukrainian psyche that stops the opportunity being seized, and why should it be any different this time?
So Ukraine is. So we were part of Soviet Union, right? So we have all this mentality still. I'm a product of independent Ukraine, but still, I was there. I would say my values are different from what my parents are and so on. But the structure of how Soviet Union existed and this effect of this redistribution of power and oligarchs that came to power when Ukraine became independent, and they stayed in power, they stay today in power, and it's really hard to. So all the initiatives that come from the ground, from civic level, they all are being used in favor of some opposition, or politicians try to grab it at once and play the political roles, politics out of it, and oligarchs are just taking advantage of even every good esteem of positiveness that exists, right? So they always try to, and they succeed in that, right? So they play their own game and they just know when to step in, how to get into power at that specific moment, right? Because all the opposition, how it was formed, right? So the Euromaidan started and they need some leaders, right? Who are the leaders? The opposition quickly came in and said, hey, we will, we'll help you guys, and that's how it's always happening with Ukraine. So there's just a big gap between the oligarchs and political elite and, people who want real change, and the oligarchs that just don't want real change, and they're in power, right? So Poroshenko is an oligarch, right? So it's, again, we can argue to which extent he is democratic and so on, but it's still the same, to be honest, right? So that's why we can't, as long as we have the same structure and money ruling the whole, money marrying politics and economics coming, together, which shouldn't be in developed countries, right? Like it's happening in Europe, it will still keep going like that, right? So unfortunately, I think that's the biggest problem of all.
Why does Ukraine matter? Does it matter? Because on one scenario, looking at the 3 versus 6, the dynamics are pretty clear if you measure them historically. This is a failing state. It is riddled with corruption. The population is shrinking. There's outmigration. There's a war going on, low level, maybe never winnable. And there is Putin's Russia that seems to be a polity that has to make war. And a Juncker, who tells you that it's going to be at least 25 years, which is surely a death sentence for some kind of rule of law, coherent, somehow democratic, free and fair elections in Ukraine. So the probability on your account today, you didn't quite put it like this, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but the probability is running high at the moment that whatever it was, this uprising called a revolution, is producing the decline of and possible disintegration of Ukraine, living in a kind of state of suspension indefinitely. And this is very bad for morale, it's bad, there's no capital investment that's going to happen on any large scale, and so on. So it's possibly a state that will follow the fate of, say, Czechoslovakia in 1939. The question is, why does it matter? Why does any of this matter? Is this another case of a failing state in a period when, democracy everywhere is not doing very well?
Yeah, right. I think when John, we discussed it with you. So, what is happening in Ukraine, like Ukraine case, like all the struggle for democracy and the way it's done, it shows something different, right?